Hello there, I'm Jane and welcome to my YouTube channel. I'm so glad you're here. This is my messy little sewing corner. It's very messy. Today will be part one of making a middle-class 16th century linen gown. I definitely expect to change my initial plan as I go along and sort of try out some new techniques along the way. I love experimenting with things I've never tried before and just sort of trying out new techniques and working out any problems or mistakes I make along the way. So doing a giant project like this is a lot of fun for me. Some things you should know before we get into it. One, I decided to completely hand sew this project. There are a ton of steps, and that's why this project is broken up into two parts. And two, while I try to be as historically accurate as is reasonable and accessible for me, please note that making this gown out of a Please note that making this dress out of a linen rayon blend is not historically accurate. There are examples of people making gowns out of fustian, which was a linen or wool and cotton blend, but you know, they didn't have rayon back then. Ah well. Using a fine wool fabric would have been more historically accurate to the merchant or middle class gowns that we know of. However, linen, especially the linen rayon blend that I chose, comes in a lot more colors and is a bit cheaper, more accessible, easier to find, so that's what I ended up using today. So without further ramblings, let's jump right in. The pattern I'm using for this gown is straight from the book The Tudor Tailor, Reconstructing 16th Century Dress by Nina Michaela and Jane Malcolm Davies. I will link this in the description. Since the patterns in the book are pictures on graph paper, I'm manually sizing them up with basic geometry. I start with counting the squares in the book, and then I block out the basic shapes on newsprint paper. After that, I start making points according to the reference line I chose, and then when I have enough points, I just connect all the dots. My plan for this gown includes an overlapped front bodice that will close with hooks and eyes, with some boning on the edges. There will also be puff sleeves and a pleated skirt with some cartridge pleats, which is a historical way of doing really large gathering stitches, in the back. I want the bodice line to be short enough that just a tiny bit of my kirtle peeks out. The only part that I struggled with was the front bodice piece. I'm not sure exactly what I did wrong, but the measurements were just not lining up. With enough patience and willpower, I did finally get the pattern piece to be okay. I also decided to only make one pattern piece for both the front bodice pieces and have a line to fold over for the shorter bodice piece. This saves paper and time, which are both quite precious. I hate making 12s, like I really hate it. I have ADHD and it makes me super impatient, but I decided to power through my impatience for this project to be absolutely sure it fits correctly over my shift and kirtle. For this, I'm using some old sheets that I don't really want to use for lining anything else. The best way I've seen 12s made is to make a mock-up with your lining or interlining fabric, and then use the adjusted pieces to cut the top fabric layer. And this really cuts down on fabric waste and how many steps you have to use. However, I just used those old sheets so I could reuse the cloth pattern later on if I want to. I usually use paper patterns, but you never know what could happen. I really like having backups. After trying on the toile and marking the places where it didn't fit quite right, I'm retracing my original pattern piece and then adding in the adjustments I made. And then there's one extra step. I'm transferring the pieces onto Swedish pattern paper, which is more fabric-like than newsprint and will last a whole lot longer. Newsprint is not an archival acid-free paper, so over a few months to a couple years, it will yellow and become very brittle. The correct thing to do here would be to sew and try on at least one more toile, but honestly, I just want to get to sewing the main garment already. Now that the toile is sorted out and I have a good pattern, I'm cutting the real fabric for the gown. The fabrics I chose are a cotton twill for the lining, a thin linen for inner lining, and that orangey rust linen rayon blend for the top fabric. The orange linen is pretty drapey, so using another layer of linen for inner lining will help stabilize the orange linen a bit and prevent wrinkles and sagging. The cotton twill was something that I got from a remnant bin at the fancy fabric store in my area. The thin linen was a random piece my grandma sent me. Thank you, Grandma. And I purchased the orange linen on sale at a big box store. Again, the most correct method would be to use a wool top fabric and a linen lining. The next merchant class gown I make will be made of wool. But I guess this orange linen gown is partly a practice garment and also more suited for summer, where it can regularly get up to 100 degrees where I live. While wool can be very breathable and also good for the summer, I guess my contemporary upbringing just makes me a bit nervous. The first step of construction is to baste the layers of fabric. And I mean basting absolutely everything. I used to not understand the importance of basting, but I've recently become a convert after being stabbed by pins for what seems like the 1,000th time. I'm following the pattern instructions in the Tudor Tailor and basting with long running stitches just outside the seam markings. But I definitely got a little impatient and then just started basting the front bodice pieces in the center with diagonal basting stitches. After basting, I'm sewing the main seams with the smallest back stitch I can manage. This is the strongest hand sewing stitch, and the smaller the stitches are, the stronger the seam is. I always try to make them as small as possible, but the thicker the layers of fabric are, the harder it is to make small stitches. I'm a little bitter that the only thread I could find in the store that matched my orange linen was a cheap polycotton quilting thread. Then, I'm giving the seams a good press to open them up. This cuts down on bulk and sets the seam in place. I'm also going to sew 2 strips of twill tape along the outer edge of the front bodice pieces to form boning channels. I'm just using a running stitch for the long sides and a felling stitch for one of the short sides. After sewing the top fabric, I'm doing the same process to the lining pieces, except with a white cotton thread. Now I'm inserting some 6mm synthetic whalebone into the boning channels I made earlier. This will keep the front edges stable when I have to close them with the hooks and eyes, as well as keep the silhouette nice and smooth while I'm wearing it. I'm closing these up with a felling stitch. It's important to align the lining as best as I can with the outer layer of fabric. I really don't want any of the lining to poke out around the edges and make the bodice look weird. Once I have the lining set in place and secured with a few pins along the seams, I'm turning the outer layer seam allowance over. Then I'll do the same with the lining, except I'm making the lining edge roughly 1/8 of an inch shorter than the outer fabric. And after that's pinned in place along all the edges, I'm sewing the lining down with a felling stitch. However, I'm just catching the seam allowance of the outer fabric so that none of the stitching shows on the outside. And my cat Molly has decided to help by getting in the way and trying to eat my sewing thread. Then I'm removing visible basting threads from the bodice. There are 3 shorter vertical boning channels and then 1 long horizontal one. I'm making these boning channels with some extra grosgrain ribbon I had lying around. This foundation layer allows the top fabric to look good even though it's a softer, drapier fabric. If there was no foundation layer, the top fabric would be droopy and sad. I'm sewing these with just a running stitch to hold the channels in place, but still allow a little flexibility if the channels are under a bit of stress. This helps prevent rips. The most important detail is that I had to make sure I didn't sew over the sections where the vertical and horizontal boning channels meet. The original pattern in the Tudor Tailor is actually for puffed and paned sleeves, but I thought that was a bit too much, so I just did the puff part. This process incorporated a bunch of skills I already had, but was way more time consuming than plain long sleeves. The puff sleeves were actually one of the most time consuming steps of this whole project. And then I just inserted some cheap, lightweight plastic boning. They probably would have used reeds to do this in the past, but while I enjoy hand sewing a whole gown, I don't think I would enjoy sourcing, soaking, and binding reeds for this. I'm good with plastic here. After the sleeve foundations have their boning, it's time to work on the top fabric layer. I probably should have basted the inner lining and top fabric together, but I like to live on the edge. After that's done, I'm going to sew 100 rows of gathering stitches. Okay, so maybe it's more like 8 rows, but it feels like 100. The first 2 rows go around the shoulder edge, and then I'm doing the same thing along the bottom edge. These gathering stitches are more like the cartridge pleats I mentioned earlier, with a longer stitch length that I'm just eyeballing as they go. After the sleeves are all gathered up, I'm sewing together some simple bands to go around the bottom of the sleeve puffs. The bands are going to have just a top layer and the interlining layer. Once the seam is stitched, I'm attaching the lining with the lazy fell stitch, as I like to call it. However, I'm going to leave the top of the band open. Then I sewed the top fabric of the sleeve band to the top fabric of the sleeve with another back stitch. My camera couldn't handle this, so it's off camera. And finally, I'm felling the lining of the sleeve band to the lining of the sleeve. And with that, the bodice and the sleeves are finished. So that does it for this video. I hope you enjoyed your time with me in my messy little sewing corner and maybe even learned something new. In part 2 of this project, which will be available in June, I'll show you how I made the skirt and I'll show you how I attached the sleeves in the skirt to the bodice, as well as decking the whole thing out with trim. And then, of course, I'll put it on and we'll have a final reveal. If you enjoyed this video, please like and subscribe to see my future projects. I upload on the 3rd Friday of every month. See you next time!